Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first in our second series of lectures in partnership with the Historic Towns Trust. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. We're delighted to bring you a new series of these lectures exploring the stories of towns and cities up and down the country. And tonight we're exploring how Swansea became the Metropolis of Wales. So apologies to anyone from Cardiff in the audience tonight. Now, before we start, I've just got some housekeeping. Now, you're all muted, so if you've got any questions or comments, please pop them in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and we'll sort through questions at the end. And our digital team is monitoring the chat, so if you have any technical issues, pop them in the chat and we'll get them sorted. So with all that over and done with, let me hand you over to the BALH chairman, Paul.
Thanks, Catherine. Evening, everybody. Just a very brief word from me, just to sort of introduce the series from the BALH perspective. Many of you may know, or hopefully do know, that we're the national charity which advocates for local history and local historians. And obviously there is no more better topic than mapping urban cartography for a local history collaboration. As Catherine says, this is the second year of our partnership with the Historic Towns Trust. And it's been, hopefully you agree, last year's lecture series was a superb success. We had 4 brilliant talks, and we've got 4 great talks lined up this sort of in the next couple of months. And we're pleased to have talks on England, Wales, and Scotland in this series. I'm now going to hand you over to our chair for this evening, who's Professor Helen Fulton from the University of Bristol. She's also a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust, and Helen is going to sort of take you through and introduce our speaker. Helen.
Thanks very much, Paul. Welcome, everybody. As Paul said, I'm Helen Fulton, and I'm a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust. The mission of the HTT is to produce historical maps and atlases of towns in the United Kingdom. We've already notched up quite a few. We have more in the pipeline, and it's something we're very interested in doing for many towns in the United Kingdom. A historical map of Swansea is in production at the moment, which is very topical for tonight's talk. It's a very great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Louise Miskell, who is Professor of History at Swansea University. Louise specialises in the modern history of Wales and Britain, with a particular focus on industrial history, urban and industrial history from the 18th to the 20th centuries. And she focuses on industries such as copper and steel. She's written particularly about the history of Swansea, including her book, which is called Intelligent Town, An Urban History of Swansea, 1780 to 1855, which was published in 2006. And she's also the co-author of a book called Swansea Copper, A Global History, published in 2020. So her paper tonight is along those lines, and it's called A Brief History of Swansea as Metropolis of Wales. Thanks very much, Louise.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we can get underway if everything goes smoothly. Let's have a look. Okay, so let's get on to screen share. So hopefully everyone can see my first slide. So I'm going to take you on a visit to Swansea in the early 19th century and tell you a little bit about Swansea's claim, and my claim as well, that it had cause to call itself the Metropolis of Wales briefly for a period in the early 19th century. So this comes really from reading trade directories and those brilliant publications that really set out the image and the characteristics of towns in the modern period. And in 1802, there was a new trade directory published in Swansea called the Swansea Guide, and it described the town at that time as the chief town in the county being Glamorgan, but not the county town. 20 odd years later, it was superseded by another guide called the New Swansea Guide, published in 1823. And by this stage, the tone was a bit more confident. the guide stated that Swansea was justly considered to be the first town in the Principality. So we're beginning to get a sense of Swansea staking its claim to precedence here. Then in 1830, a third guidebook, Matthew's Swansea Directory, was published, which used the phrase, and I think this is the first time the phrase Metropolis of Wales was used in relation to Swansea, and it was used in that Matthew's Directory of 1830. Now, directories, as many of you will know, trade directories do need to be treated with a bit of caution, and their main objective was to sell the commercial benefits of places to prospective tradespeople, visitors and investors. So they do have a tendency to indulge in a degree of boosterism. Nevertheless, I think these bold claims about Swansea shouldn't be dismissed, because I think they point to something significant that was going on in the town in the early decades of the 19th century. And so in this talk, I want to explore Swansea's evolution as an urban centre, when it was transformed really in these early decades of the 19th century from being a kind of busy but fairly peripheral port and industrial town to a place which actually viewed itself as a kind of unofficial Welsh capital, which I think it did for a short period, which came to a head in the 1830s and 40s. And my claim is that really there were sort of three closely interlinked factors which made this happen. First of all, there was kind of a step change in the position of the town in relation to the global copper trade. And it stemmed from a change in tariff legislation in the 1820s, but there were various knock-on effects from this growing status. We've all heard the phrase copperopolis probably applied to Swansea, but this copperopolis status gave Swansea a kind of confidence in a number of other fields too. Secondly, I think politics was, or political reorganisation in any case, was another factor. The reorganisation of parliamentary representation created two new parliamentary seats in the 1830s, which propelled some very powerful Swansea representatives into government. So this kind of gave the town a sort of an edge, a confident edge as well. And third, I think science, or more broadly perhaps Swansea's strong tradition of literary and scientific culture. This kind of gave the town a foothold in a prestigious scientific circuit in early Victorian Britain. And it distinguished Swansea from other Welsh towns that didn't really have that same part to play in scientific and cultural life. So those are kind of my three sort of broad themes, I guess, that I'm going to be talking about. But to begin, I mean, it's appropriate we use a map here that, you know, as we've just heard, maps are really crucial, I think, for understanding urban history and placing towns. But I'm starting here in the 18th century. This is an extract from Yeats's map of Glamorgan from 1799. In the 18th century, in the early 18th century, Swansea's population was under 2,500. Now, that really puts it in the rank of a kind of small myriad of sort of small towns of England and Wales in that period. You know, compared to places like Bristol, Liverpool, Norwich, it was really a kind of urban minnow. It served as, those sorts of places served as economic and cultural foci for wider regions. Swansea was quite marginal in comparison. It was small in size, but it was also peripheral, of course, in location. Lying almost 70 miles west of the River Severn estuary, it was a very remote prospect, really, from travellers, would-be visitors who were looking west beyond the last major metropolis of Bristol. And that, I use that word metropolis in the case of Bristol advisedly, because I think in the 18th century, really like other Glamorgan towns, Swansea fell very much into Bristol's shadow. It lacked banking facilities. That it had a relative absence of wealthy, homegrown commercial elites. And Bristol, which was at that time also known by some as the Metropolis of the West, served as a kind of financial and trading centre for Glamorgan towns in that period, including Swansea. In fact, you know, Bristol money lay behind, and Bristol personnel actually, lay behind much of the early 18th century entrepreneurial activity in Swansea. And this was very evident in the case of the copper industry. It was actually a Bristol man, a surgeon called John Lane, who was responsible for starting Swansea's first copper smelting works, which is this one, known as Llangabellach or Landor Copper Works, established in 1717. And the neighbouring copper works at White Rock, established a couple of decades later, had even stronger Bristol links. It was run by a succession of Bristol-based partnerships who were interested in smelting copper in Swansea to supply the metal to the brass trades in Bristol and its vicinity, as well as to merchants, Bristol merchants engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. And White Rock, as you can see on this image actually, was known to some in the 18th and the early 19th century as the Bristol Copper Works or the Bristol Company Works. So in all of these senses, Swansea was under Bristol's shadow. It lacked, you know, kind of commercial infrastructures as well. In the late 1720s, when the Llangabellach Works was in operation, there were just 2 postal deliveries per week to Swansea, which left members of the town's trading community suffering from want of information and the ability to transact trade swiftly. Scroll forward to the 1750s. Copper smelting is gradually intensifying. There are 4 copper works in this vicinity by the 1750s. You've got Upper Forest, Middle Bank and Upper Bank, as well as White Rock. And from the 1750s onwards, though, I think we start to see the beginnings of an uplift. There are new demands for copper emerging in international markets, which give a kind of boost to Swansea's copper smelting industry. New applications of copper in goods as diverse as things like, on the left-hand side of the slide there, the large boiling vessels that were used on sugar plantations for refining sugar. These were, you know, made of copper because of its heat conductivity, but they became an important market and a new use of copper, which Swansea benefited from. And also sheathing materials, and copper had, by the second half of the 18th century, an important role to Navy and merchant shipping customers, because it was being used as a material to cover the hulls of ships to protect those from erosion and to help them move more efficiently and swiftly through the water as well. So we've got an image here on the right-hand side of the slide of a copper sheathing being applied to the hull of a wooden sailing vessel. And you know, you can get a sense just from looking at that of the kind of volume of copper that was used. This was a really important new market, and it gave impetus really to the copper trade in Swansea in the second half of the 18th century. So in response to these new demands, there was a spate of expansion in copper smelting, new investors entering the trade in Swansea, new firms appearing on the banks of the River Tawe in that kind of concentrated area of copper production. And they included a firm called Vivian and Sons, who opened a works at Havod on the riverside. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that firm and its leaders later on. Now, all of this is going on. The copper trade is beginning to flourish. But at this point in proceedings, you know, the latter part of the 18th century, all this copper that's being smelted in Swansea, or the vast majority of it anyway, is made from copper ore that was shipped into Swansea from Cornwall via the Bristol Channel. So Cornwall being the major sort of copper ore field in the British Isles. Interestingly, though, something changed in the 1820s that was of great significance to Swansea. And it was brought about by a relaxation in tariff legislation, which effected a momentous shift in the trade, the global trade for copper ore. The pivotal piece of legislation here was the 1827 Customs Act, which included for the first time copper ore amongst a range of goods that could be imported free of duty prior to being processed for subsequent re-export. And what this meant was that copper smelters in Swansea could now ship in ores in bulk from rich mining regions all over the world. So suddenly on their radar were copper mining regions in Latin America, in South Australia, in South Africa, and elsewhere. And they could begin to ship from these places. They had much greater production levels than did Cornwall. So it really opened up an upscaling of the industry. And the consequences of this for Swansea were really momentous. It became, because of this, the centre of an international copper ore market. And I've put an extract from the Cambrian in June 1842 on the left-hand side. The Cambrian was the English language weekly newspaper that was published in Swansea. And what you can see there is a report. The Cambrian carried these kind of reports about every 2 weeks, because roughly fortnightly, there was a big copper ore sale taking place in Swansea, whereby huge quantities of copper ore being shipped to the town were put out for purchase, and buyers from all the Swansea smelting firms and sellers representing the international copper mining interests were all represented. And what you can see on this particular sales record is the word Cobre at the top, which was the name of a Cuban mining company. So all of that, most of that first column is a list of all the Cuban ore that was being sold in Swansea that week. And below that, you've got Chile. And then you've got references to some smaller ore parcels from partly from Ireland. But I think the dominance of the Cuban ore in the 1840s and the beginnings of the emergence of Chilean ore coming in, and all these different firms, you know, trading to purchase them. What that represents is the way in which Swansea became, in this period, a kind of a centre for international metal trade. And that is partly what inspired myself and Chris Evans, my co-author there, to write Swansea Copper, which we published in 2020, as Helen said earlier. The significant thing about that, as you'll see from the little tagline at the top, is that we're claiming really that the copper trade gave Swansea a global history. It gave Swansea, an importance that went well beyond the local. You know, copper smelting was a local industry, but with kind of global implications. And just to kind of hammer the point home even further, one of the contemporaries that we quote in the book is the French metallurgist Frédéric Leplay, who visited Swansea and wrote about its influence in the copper trade. And writing in 1848, he said that Swansea copper at that point knows no limits other than those of the globe itself. So it's a pretty clear indictment of Swansea's, international importance at that period. So The escalation of copper smelting and copper ore trading in Swansea in these years had big knock-on implications. It made participating industrialists like J.H. Vivian, John Henry Vivian, pictured here. I promised you I'd say something a bit more about the Vivians. He was the head of Vivian and Sons. It made him one of the most kind of influential figures in Swansea in the early 19th century. And now he's an interesting guy. His family background is in banking and mineral investment in the mining district of Cornwall. But he has a formal education. He's including a spell at the University of Freiburg's Mining Institute in 1803, where he studied geology. But he's based in Swansea from the beginning of 19th century. His father established the family's copper smelting business there, and he gained smelting expertise really on the job at the first copper smelting business that they were involved in at Penclawdd, and then at the Hafod Works, which is pictured here, which opened 1808 to 09. And the expertise he built up really in copper smelting established him as a kind of global, not global, but certainly national and international expert in his field, partly through the publication of technical accounts of copper smelting processes. But I think more than that, you know, he's not just a kind of industrialist. He's somebody with a real sense of the needs of the town and a sense of how to achieve them. So he becomes one of a new breed of public men in Swansea, so who I think took a much wider interest in the development of the town beyond their immediate industrial interests. So I'm going to say a little bit about, or give a couple of examples of how he actually does this. First of all, there's kind of interesting episode in the 1820s, which Vivian is very involved in. And that was the major banking crisis of the mid-1820s, when he, along with a number of other members of Swansea's kind of emerging business and industrial elite, stepped in with a plan which was designed to kind of secure the circulation of cash in the town, but also further than that, to try kind of establish Swansea as a sort of recognised financial centre. Now, obviously, somebody like Vivian has vested interests in being able to access cash, you know, to pay his workers and keep his own business running. But his interest in this goes a lot further. So, as I said, there's a banking crisis in the middle of the 1820s, really precipitated by over-speculation in Latin American mining ventures. And it caused the collapse of numerous country banks throughout Britain, not just in Swansea. It was a kind of national issue at the time. And partly in response to that, the Bank of England in London established in 1826 a branch committee. So it started to consider setting up branch banks in provincial centres around Britain. Now, in Swansea, the effects of the financial crisis were felt quite directly. There were 2 local Swansea banks that were forced to suspend payment during the crisis, and the continuance of trade and commerce in the town was deemed to be in doubt. And in response to that, Vivian and another contemporary, who I'll say more about later, called Louise Weston Dilwyn, they got together with a delegation and made a direct request to the Bank of England for permission to have one of the first tranche of branch banks in Britain established in Swansea. Now, this was a pretty bold move, to say the least. You know, the Bank of England's branch committee was only established in May, and come June, you know, a delegation from Swansea is turning up on its doorstep saying, we want one of these branches, we need it. you can see, I went to look at the Bank of England Archives minute book to see their version of this. And this is a little extract from it. It says, a deputation consisting of His Grace the Duke of Beaufort, he was the major landowner of Swansea at the time, Sir John Morris, another major industrialist figure, Mr. Vivian and several others presented a memorial signed by above 60 of the principal landowners, manufacturers and others, pointing out the great benefit the bank would confer on the Principality of Wales by establishing a branch bank at Swansea. So they were kind of really taken by surprise, but also fairly impressed with the calibre of this delegation that turned up to make its appeal. But, you know, the bank had already made approaches to Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester and Birmingham to gauge interest in forming branch banks there. But really, because of the impact of this delegation, they decided that Swansea would become one of the first of these branches. Liverpool was left out, much to its disgust, and Swansea had only the third branch bank of the Bank of England to be opened in Britain. It was a significant coup, really, for the town. And what it did was it really sort of established Swansea as the main financial centre in South Wales, or certainly gave it a claim to be the main financial centre in South Wales. And I think, well, that status was really sort of unchallenged for the next 2 decades. So the success in establishing the Bank of England branch in the town was just one of a number of developments, local and national, in the 1820s and 30s, which I think begin to reflect Swansea's growing profile as an urban centre. Other developments elevated its influence in political life too. So I'm moving on to kind of my politics theme a little bit here. Now, for much of the early 18th and 19th century, political life in the county of Glamorgan had really revolved around Cardiff. This served as the polling town at election time. The county parliamentary seat of Glamorgan boroughs was dominated by the main landowning families, whose candidates were usually returned uncontested. And the borough seat, in which Swansea was just a contributory borough, was monopolised by the landowning Mackworth family of Neath, and then by the Butes of Cardiff, the big landowning family of Cardiff. Swansea's own principal landowner, the Duke of Beaufort, who I mentioned earlier, his main residence was in Badminton in Gloucestershire. His visits for Swansea were relatively occasional, and in his absence, he really ran his affairs via his local agents. So he was a more distant figure, really, and didn't kind of represent the town politically in any sense. But under the 1832 Reform Act, which redrew the parliamentary constituency map of England and Wales, rapid population increases in South Wales were acknowledged with the addition of a second member of parliament for the county seat of Glamorgan. Added to that, the old borough, Glamorgan borough's constituency was also divided, and a new seat of Swansea boroughs was created. And this included Swansea, Aberavon, Kenfig, Loughor and Neath. But it was called Swansea boroughs, and I think that seemed to be quite significant from a Swansea point of view. This latter reform, the creation of this Swansea borough seat in particular, brought formal recognition to Swansea's rising status as a kind of capital town for the western part of Glamorgan. And the first occupant of the new seat was our old friend, John Henry Vivian, who was elected and opposed in the Liberal interest. And in his address to his new constituents outside the town hall in Swansea, Vivian spoke of his pride in our town being elevated to that rank and station, which from its importance, it is so well entitled, in being constituted the chief place of a new district of boroughs. So he kind of, jumped on the significance of that in his electoral address. Now, a week after Vivian's election, the polling for the county seat, the second county seat, was held in Bridgend, and at that election, Lewis Weston Dilwyn was elected to the new 2-member Glamorgan constituency, and the other member was Christopher Rice Mansell Talbot of Margam. But on Dilwyn's election to the second seat, his proposer, William Crawshay Jr., emphasised Dilwyn's background. He was a descendant of a Quaker family. He was presented very much as a friend of the poor man, a kind of advocate of the poor. But I think what's significant really is that the election of both Vivian and Dilwyn at that time, at a stroke, brought these two very powerful and influential Swansea voices into Parliament. And it marked a shift away from the dominant influence of the more eastern part of Glamorgan over the political life of the county. So as you can see here, Dilwyn has industrialist interests. He's head of the Cambrian pottery for a time. But, like Vivian, there's more to him than that. He's very interested in science. He's a naturalist. He's a published author. And he becomes, like Vivian, this kind of public figure, advocate of Swansea on the national stage. Once elected to Parliament, Vivian and Dilwyn were even more effective advocates for Swansea than they had been already. They were both involved in the Bank of England branch deputation, but with their political status now enhanced, there was even more momentum, I think, behind their activities. Vivian in particular lost no time in seeking to reform other areas of administration, in particular, reforming the way justice was administered in the county of Glamorgan. While Swansea's influence was on the rise in commercial and political spheres, in the 1830s, Swansea had no formal status as a centre for legal administration. It held no legal court sittings or court hearings beyond the level of magistrates' courts. And the assizes were held in Cardiff in the spring and in Cowbridge in the summer. So all the kind of High Court judicial business took place away from Swansea in those two places. Now, as the town's newly elected MP, Vivian gave notice of a petition to remove the assizes, one session of the assizes, to Swansea. And 33 prominent bankers, solicitors, doctors, retailers and industrialists from the town and neighbourhood followed his lead and asked the Port Reeve of Swansea to convene a public meeting in the town hall to pursue this matter. And this is an extract again from the Cambrian newspaper, March 1833, reporting on this request to convene the public meetings. And you can see who the supporters of this initiative were there. Their case really was based on the argument that population growth and weight of judicial business emanating from the west of the county made the absence of an assize court sitting in that region anomalous. And eventually the Privy Council agreed with them, and the first spring assizes were held in Swansea late in February 1835. They milked this. The first appearance of a High Court judge, the first assize sitting, was an occasion for great public ceremony and celebration. The judge was met on his approach to Swansea by a cortege of 20 gentlemen's carriages and a train of horsemen who accompanied him into the town. He was watched, according to the Cambrian, by a vast concourse of the inhabitants of the town and neighbourhood. And the following morning, a church service, which was customarily held to precede High Court proceedings, by the Reverend Hewson, involved a sermon in which Hewson strayed from the scriptural content of his script to observe that it was a matter of great congratulation that a court of judicature had been established in this town, and this populous and increasing district admitted to a full and proper participation in the benefits arising from efficient administration of the law. So, you know, another success, another sort of flag in the sand for Swansea's growing importance. By the middle of the 1830s then, Swansea's star was rising, its influence over its surrounding region as a commercial, political and legal centre had gained formal recognition in a number of ways. Viewed in this context, the establishment of a philosophical and literary society in Swansea in 1835 may seem relatively unimportant. Many towns in Britain by the 1830s had lit and fill institutions, as they were known, which hosted lectures, housed collections of books and artifacts, and provided a kind of polite space for town's educated elite to meet and mingle. And Swansea was by no means in the vanguard of the lit and fill movement, but it did have a well-established literary culture prior to this 1830s initiative. It had a weekly English language newspaper dating from January 1804, which had been established by local businessman George Haynes. It was called the Cambrian, but rather like his contemporaries Vivian and Dilwyn, Haynes, when he decided to establish this newspaper, was not content just to view it as purely a local paper serving the immediate town and neighbourhood, and rather it was launched as a provincial paper intended more particularly, as it's stated, for the use, convenience and advantage of the Principality of Wales. And I think the choice of the Cambrian as the title also was meant as a nod to that. It promised to remove the inconveniences under which various interests in Wales have long laboured for the want of a newspaper establishment within the Principality. So it was the first English language weekly newspaper to be published in Wales, and it sort of took full advantage of that position. It reported foreign and domestic news, as well as important legal, commercial and financial developments. So the launch of the Cambrian in 1804 had been part of a much wider flowering of print culture in the town. By 1815, Swansea had 5 libraries, including the Glamorgan Library in Wine Street, which was the town's first public library. And a thriving book trade was evident by the early 19th century, with some 7 bookbinders, booksellers, printers and stationers listed in the 1823 New Swansea Guide. Welsh language print culture flourished too. Seren Gulmer was the first weekly Welsh language newspaper published in Swansea in January 1814, and really placing Swansea in the vanguard of Welsh language publishing at that time. It was the brainchild of a Baptist minister called Joseph Harris. It wasn't an immediate success. It had to be relaunched in 1818, but within a year it was selling 1,500 to 2,000 copies per issue. So it had established itself in the market. And there was also a scholarly society in Swansea for the promotion of the Welsh language, which was called the Swansea Cymrageiddion Society, established in 1822. Originating in London, many Welsh towns adopted these societies. The idea was that they conducted all of their business in Welsh and held regular meetings which focused around a debate of some kind on various themes. So all of this was going on already, print culture, publishing in Swansea. But it was really the Royal Institution of South Wales which became Swansea's flagship cultural institution. And as I've explained on the slide there, it was an evolving institution. It was first established really in 1835, but then it was just called Swansea Scientific Society. It was renamed the Royal Institution of South Wales 3 years later, after its founder members, who included Dilwyn, Vivian, and a group of others, applied for royal assent to adopt that name. So they really had, again, pretensions to be more than just a local scientific society. And then also they managed to fund and build their own building to house museum collections, library collections, and a big lecture hall, which was completed in the early 1840s. So this became Swansea's flagship cultural institution. And I think, you know, as well as serving scientific interests locally and wealthy visitors, the interesting thing about the Royal Institution of South Wales in Swansea was it also became really used as a kind of vehicle for further enthusiastic place promotion by the town's urban leaders. In the 1840s, Vivian, Dilwyn, and others amongst its membership succeeded in persuading the British Association for the Advancement of Science to hold their annual meeting in Swansea, the first ever in Wales. And bear in mind that this is pre-railway connection to Swansea. So they had to persuade members of the British Association that it would be okay, they could get to Swansea even without a rail link. And that they should make the effort because there was such a thriving scientific community to meet there. So this meant that Swansea, with its smart new museum premises, played host to some of the country's most eminent scientists and attracted widespread press attention from around Britain for the duration of the week-long British Association meeting in 1848. And it was an event, I think we can safely say, that had lasting impact. Yet another trade directory, published this time by the Bristol firm of Hunt & Co. in 1849, observed of Swansea that the town is continually improving in every way, and that there is a spirit of intelligence abroad that contributes much to the well-being of its inhabitants. And as you heard earlier, I sort of latched onto this description of Swansea, which is used in one or two other sources in this period as well, as an intelligent town for the title of my book, because it just struck me as a very interesting way for a town that was ostensibly an industrial centre to be describing it in itself in this way and being viewed in this way by outsiders too. So I think by the 1830s, as you'll have gathered, Vivian and Dilwyn in particular had emerged as two of the dominant figures in this kind of axis in Swansea, which had delivered the Bank of England branch, the new assize court hearings, and the town's parliamentary representation. But I think they also benefited from a wider ethos of questioning, curiosity, which infused a broader section of the town's middle classes who were kind of members of the Royal Institution in the town. Eagerness to understand the characteristics of their history, geology, climate, environment, and landscape, economy and languages gave rise to a kind of confident sense of place in Swansea, which in turn instilled in the town's urban elite a shared vision that Swansea was somewhere which could and should play a greater part in the life of the wider region and of Wales as a whole. Of course, there were other factors going on too. Swansea's growth as an industrial commercial centre, as we've seen, has been important, as was the accompanying increase in population and physical extent of the town, which to some extent forced the redrawing of the boundaries and the redistribution of administrative functions from the older county centres of Glamorgan, which it had now eclipsed. But what's significant is that there was ready to capitalise on this in Swansea, a cohort of well-informed and widely respected individuals who had built up their credentials of public figures in the town, whether medical, industrial, scientific or literary. So it's from its early 18th century position of subservience to Cardiff and Bristol in particular, Swansea was by the mid-19th century recognisable by most contemporaries, I think, as an important urban centre, at least in the South Wales region, if not in Wales as a whole. And people were beginning to identify it as one of the distinguishing characteristics of this new Welsh metropolis. So all of this, I'm claiming, amounts to an important moment in Swansea's history. But of course it didn't last. Even before the visit of the British Association in 1848, there were signs that Swansea's influence in Wales might be about to be eclipsed. And we can see it, I think, from about 1839 with the opening of the Bute West Dock in Cardiff. This really set Cardiff on a new trajectory to becoming the major coal shipping port of South Wales, and positioned Cardiff to capitalise on the rapid development of the eastern part of the South Wales coalfields in the second half of the 19th century. The scale of Cardiff's population and commercial growth eclipsed that of Swansea within a few decades and had a more lasting impact on the urban hierarchy in South Wales. But Swansea's period of ascendancy, which I'm dating in those decades from the sort of 1820s to the 1840s, is still important because it reminds us, I think, that urban status is never static. As barometers of economic, social and political life, towns and cities are never guaranteed a permanent place in the limelight. Instead, their histories reflect the visions and ambitions of particular generations of urban leaders. And in Swansea, both Vivian and Dilwyn died within a few months of each other in 1855. So I think that almost symbolically brought to an end that particular generation that I focused on in tonight's talk. Though their vision of Swansea as a Welsh metropolis didn't last, though, and this is my final point, their legacy very much lived on in other ways, not least through the continuation of the work of the Royal Institution of South Wales, which still exists as a learned society, a very active one in Swansea. This is a recent picture of it. The original building still in use on the left-hand side of the slide. And also in the establishment of the University College in Swansea in 1920, which you can see pictured on this postcard. And that was established significantly on the former Vivian family estate at Singleton Park. So those, I think, are the lasting legacy of Vivian, Dilwyn and their generation, and a sign of the ambitions, the bigger ambitions they had to Swansea's claim to be Metropolis of Wales. Thank you.
Wow, well, I think I speak for everyone when I say that was really interesting. I honestly didn't even know that Swansea had such a massive metal industry. So I think we've all learned something tonight, and I think we're all grateful for having learned all of this. So I'll hand over now to Helen to go through some of the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Louise, for that wonderful paper, setting out very clearly the sort of rise and fall, if you like, of Swansea's preeminence in South Wales. And it is fascinating to realise that Swansea almost could have been the capital of Wales rather than Cardiff. Very, very interesting. We do have a couple of questions coming up in the chat, so I'll go to those first before I ask my own questions. So Isabel Murphy has a question. She says, what was the main route into Swansea in the early 19th century? Was a ferry involved in crossing the River Neath?
There were several ferries involved, depending, of course, where exactly you were coming from. If you were coming from England, you'd have had to have crossed either the River Severn or the Bristol Channel or the Severn Estuary, you would have had to cross the River Neath. And also, if you were coming in along the south coast, the Towie, the mouth of the Towie River, had a ferry crossing until the building of a new bridge, I think, sometime in the early 19th century. I can't remember the date of that. But it's a really interesting point, Isabel, that you make, because it does reinforce this sense that if you were in that part of Britain, you were peripheral to kind of the major centres of metropolitan and urban life. And really, not until the coming of the South Wales Railway in the 1850s did most of those sort of barriers to easy access into Swansea become reduced. And I think it sort of gained a lot, really, from the arrival of the railway. Yeah, I mean, I've read lots of accounts of tortuous crossings of the Bristol Channel, people getting sort of the tide turning and them having to return to Devon or Cornwall and then come back the next day. And, it was so unpredictable travel times, difficult to kind of imagine now.
Thanks, Louise. Can you say a bit more about the coming of the railways and the impact that had?
Yeah, I mean, some of the people I mentioned there were kind of significant promoters of the South Wales Railway, probably most notably CRM Talbot, who was a big railway promoter. The railway came to the town in 1850 with the opening of the first line, which connected Swansea with the major centres in England. So it meant that, everything speeded up, delivery of news, movement of people, trade restrictions were eased, but it also led to a big rethink, I think, about the sort of supplementary transport connections in Swansea. So, immediately, once you've got a railway link, you have to connect your dock to the railway. So they have to build sort of branch lines and then, connecting with the interior as well. So there's a kind of scramble to kind of build railway lines linking with the South Wales Railway down the various valleys. So it was the start of a kind of opening up of Swansea, but it also, I think, took a while for the full benefits of it to be realised because of all these sort of knock-on connections that had to be constructed. But it just adds, doesn't it, to this point I was making at the end that, I think urban leaders in this period could never really rest on their laurels. There was always a new influence coming along that they had to respond to. The fear of being left behind was always driving some of these ambitions. Yes, very true. And same thing happens now with continual changes in technology of various kinds. A couple of other questions. Firstly, one from John Townley. Where in Britain were Swansea's main markets for copper and how were they linked pre-railways? Brilliant question, John. Thank you for that. Where in Britain? Well, as I was saying, a lot of copper that was being smelted in Swansea ended up in forms that were exported. The Vivian family had a big customer in the East India Company that was shipping copper, exporting copper, in large quantities from, certainly in the early 19th century, in the period when the Harvard Works was first established. They were selling stuff to the brass firms in Bristol who were manufacturing it into all sorts of copper and brass goods for export. Some of it finding its way into the Atlantic slave trade in the form of barter items. And that is an element of Swansea's history as a copper smelting centre, which we have to own up to and acknowledge. But the Vivians also jumped on the copper sheathing bandwagon, and they were selling their copper sheathing to shipbuilders, ship repairers, the naval dockyards in places like Plymouth and Devonport, as well as all sorts of ship repairing places in the ports around Britain. So that was an important one. And copper basically ends up in all sorts of, you make whiskey stills out of copper. They were selling it to food and drink processors. The inside of steam locomotive boilers are full of copper tubes. It's one of these weird things about copper. You can't always see where it ends up because it's kind of not always visible, but the locomotive industry, the railway industry were big customers. So there's a whole array. One other thing I'll mention while we're on the point, another of the Swansea firms, the Grenfells, they sold a lot of copper to textile manufacturers in the form of printing cylinders. So those were made of copper and they were used in the cotton textile industry to put prints onto cotton cloth. So it's really interconnected with lots of other industries and forms of transport in a myriad of ways, I think.
Great, thank you very much. And a question from Philip Shepherd, who asks, what role did the churches or religion play in the rise of Swansea's profile?
Yeah, another really interesting one. There's a lot more research to do on this. I mentioned briefly about Dilwyn being from a Quaker background. I do think the Quakers, in an earlier period from what I was talking about there, are quite important. Swansea was a sort of a centre for religious dissent, really, in the 17th and 18th century. It was sort of, it's seen as a kind of safe haven, really, for dissenting religious groups. And Quakers flocked there, and many of them established banks in Swansea. Some of the first banks were Quaker banks. And I think that tradition brought families like the Vivians to the town then in the early 19th century to sort of mingle with that community. But of course, there are lots of other non-conformist congregations as well, Unitarians, Wesleyans. Many of the big industrialists like the Vivians and the Grenfells were Anglicans, but they were very sort of accommodating of non-conformist sentiments, and they often funded the building of non-conformist chapels, for example. So it was a kind of, I get the sense that it was a fairly relaxed religious profile, relatively tension-free. Have to confess though, I haven't done much dedicated research on the religious history of the town, so I could be missing something, but that is very much kind of feel that you get when you read, generally about Swansea in this period. So, but it would be really good to do a bit of extra digging on that, I think.
And of course, there's a tremendous legacy of church and chapel buildings in Swansea even today. I mean, many of the chapels no longer in use, but some of the buildings are still there. Very striking, real indicator of urban pride, I think.
Yeah, and amazing sort of amazingly ambitious buildings as well, that were meant to make a statement, I think, on the urban landscape. Yeah, it's absolutely true.
So we have a question from L. Bennett, who asks, why did the copper industry stop?
Competition is the short answer. Yeah, I mean, I think by the latter part of the 19th century, the copper industry was really changing a lot. There was a whole new application of copper in the growing sort of electrical products industry. So all of a sudden, all these new customers wanted to buy copper that was particularly high in electrical conductivity. The stuff that was being smelted in Swansea didn't quite fit that bill very well. There were whole new sort of areas of smelting being set up in North America, on the ore fields in Australia and elsewhere. where ore was being mined, huge scale, open cast, and also there were new technologies for smelting copper. You know, the whole sort of raison d'etre really for Swansea being a smelting centre was the fact you needed so much coal to smelt copper at high temperature in the, you know, of the technology of the 18th and early 19th century, that it made sense to do it on a coalfield site. 100 years later, you know, the reliance on coal is, you know, is lessened. They've got, you know, much more fuel efficient technologies for smelting copper, and it just took away the advantage of basing it in Swansea really. So if you were mining loads of ore somewhere else, why ship it to Swansea? Just smelt it over there. And you know, it was just one of those economic realities that there was no way out of. And so Swansea, I think the last copper smelting in Swansea was actually in 1924. But they carried on sort of processing copper and making copper goods for another few decades, up to about the middle of the 20th century. But it was very much a shadow of his former self by that time. So it's a story of sort of, you know, changing technologies and growing international competition is what happened.
Thank you. A question from Isabel Murphy, who asks, apart from the boosterism of the trade directories, do you consider they were an adequate reflection of the town's economic profile?
Oh, I love trade directories. I mean, you know, those lists, all those lists of businesses and principal inhabitants and the major institutions, are they adequate? Are they fully reliable? Probably not. I mean, some of them, you know, you had to pay to get your entry into them. So you can sort of assume that probably only some of the more profitable, permanent, established businesses were actually, you know, getting in there. I'm sure they didn't give anywhere near a sort of full profile of commercial activity. There had been a lot of establishments which perhaps didn't feature. But, you know, but they're what we've got. And I think, you know, they are very useful. And what I like to do, as you saw at the start there, is sort of compare, you know, successive publications of directories across years, and you can get a sense of change over time then. And, you know, as historians, that's what we're all about. We're trying to work out how places sort of shift and evolve. So that's kind of how I use it. But, you know, as I said, they need to be kind of treated like any historical source, with a bit of caution and sometimes with a pinch of salt as well.
Okay, thank you. A question from Pamela Bowring. Which ports from Cornwall were sending copper ore to Swansea?
That's an interesting one. Because if you know much about the geography of Cornwall, which I'm sure some of you do, you know, the ore fields were kind of in the centre around the kind of Camborne, Redruth area. For a long time, there was no rail link to the north of the county, so everything had to be shipped south via the River Fal, round the kind of, what do you call it, the foot of Cornwall, is that, you know what I mean, the edge of Cornwall, and then into the Bristol Channel. Later on, I think a rail link was built north to, I think it's Port Reith, that was on the north coast of Cornwall, and I think that became a kind of, in theory anyway, a faster access point. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, the actual crossing of the Bristol Channel was the difficult bit, you know, almost whatever port you shipped out of. It was that crossing itself which was very sort of subject to changeable tides and weather. And it did, you know, Swansea smelters did not like being reliant on Cornwall so heavily. They tried desperately. They were always digging in Wales to try and discover, you know, copper ore, which they did briefly in the late 18th century. They discovered a big cache of copper ore in Anglesey on the Paris mountain site. That was worked really intensively in the late 18th century until it was pretty much exhausted. But you know, but Cornwall held sway, I think, for most of that period.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll just come to a question from John Townley because it relates to your answer. John asks, when Swansea began importing copper ores, did this mean the demise of the Anglesey mines?
Not really, because I think the Anglesey ones were kind of worked out. They, unlike in Cornwall, where it was all deep mining, the Anglesey deposits were mined open cast style. So they just dug it, you know, as fast as they could, really. And so it didn't really last very long. And, you know, Cornwall, you know, the Cornish ores were still on the market very much throughout that period as well, at the end of the 18th century. No, I think the Cornish deposits were becoming more difficult to mine. They weren't quite sufficient enough to fulfill this growing sort of demand for copper. And I think, you know, it was a good thing really for the Swansea smelters that the access to those international ores came along when it did, because I think they were finding it increasingly difficult to access other sources of ore at the time.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions. I think we're nearing the end. Andrew Wright has a rather technical question. He's asking, how many tons of coal were required per ton of copper ore?
Yeah, I mean, that is, well, the figure that you will see bandied about is 20, basically. You know, I have no scientific knowledge or background, and I've never tried smelting anything in my life. But from what I've read, the figure you usually get is around 20 tons of coal per 1 ton of copper ore, which explains the kind of the economics of smelting on a coalfield location. Because and when you look at account books actually of the early smelting firms, carriage of coals from mine to smelting site is a huge chunk of their outgoings. You know, they're always trying to minimize the cost of moving that coal, and that was what gave Swansea its competitive edge over, you know, other smelting sites. I mean, there was smelting going on in the Wye Valley in the early 18th century, and Neath as well. Prior to Swansea, they started smelting, but Swansea was able to kind of locate smelting works right on the coalfield, right next to a river, which had access to a harbour. So it managed to get everything in place that suited the needs of the industry at that time. So yeah, it's, you know, that's the figure. I have no idea if it's accurate though, really, I have to be honest. But that's the figure that you always see. 20%.
Sounds plausible. Certainly explains, you know, massive pollution, that coal burning all the time. Gosh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we've come to the last question, and it's very appropriately from Giles Darks, who is the cartographer for the Historic Towns Trust, currently working on the map of Swansea. So it's nice to have a question from Giles. He asks, in what ways was Swansea a regional centre for West Glamorgan? Did it draw in people from the surrounding areas?
Yeah, really good question, Giles. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, very much so. I think the fact that it had a banking sector, it had a well-established provisions market, the fact that it had, you know, a sort of a retail centre as well. It had these bookshops, it had the libraries, it had the kind of institutions that, you know, the smaller towns in the hinterland, you know, when, you know, western portion of Glamorgan and into Carmarthenshire even, didn't quite have. So, you know, people came into Swansea to transact their business, to access banks, and to access news. So it did, I think, it had this local hinterland as well as the profile, you know, looking east that I was concentrating more on. And I think that is important. You know, obviously points west, you know, they took even longer to get the railway link and to kind of be connected up to, you know, centres of urban life in Britain than Swansea did. And the South Wales Railway made slow progress further west in Glamorgan and into Carmarthenshire. So Swansea always, I think, had that side to it. And I think the brief bit I mentioned about the Welsh language culture in the town partly points to that as well, that it had this influence into kind of more mid-Welsh speaking Wales, again, which is different from towns further east in Glamorgan. So it's an important point to bear in mind about Swansea.
Well, I think we've all learned a lot tonight. So thank you for all those questions. They've been very in-depth, especially the proportion of coals to ore. That's very technical. There are 3 more lectures in this Historic Towns Trust series, and full details can be found on the BALH website. So we hope to see you there as well. And obviously, if you'd like to find more information about Swansea's Copperopolis, then Louise's book, I suppose, is one way to go. Is that right?
Yeah, Swansea Copper. Yeah, and they're available online. I think is probably the best way, because it's published by an American press, but I think you can get it via online retailers.
Great. So we've always got lots of different online events coming up in the next few weeks at BALH. So if you have enjoyed this lecture, I do hope that you book for future ones. And I think that's about it for this evening.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you, Louise, very much indeed for a wonderful paper. As someone who lives in Swansea, I'm a great fan of your books, so it's great to hear your talk. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Good
Wonderful.
evening. Bye-bye.